I love the history of the American West, and particularly I love old mines. So when Brent moved to a historic ghost town and started posting his videos, including mine exploration videos, I got hooked. Today I'm going to be recreating the cross-section of the Union Mine at Cerro Gordo, and later in the video we'll be showing it to him to see what he thinks.
That's the mine. That's so cool.
I've always enjoyed recreating smaller versions of things that I like, from movies and TV shows and games, and I thought, why not do the same thing for some of my favorite YouTube content? And that's a series that I've been working on that I really enjoy. One of my favorite things about it is being able to gift the project to the person who originally is responsible for the inspiration. It's also awesome to see in the comments just how many of you watch the same content that I do. For this initial step, it was important to have a nice new blade that wouldn't mess up the foam and make nice clean cuts. I was considering carving these out with a Dremel to give it that cut rock appearance, but opted to leave the tunnels straight for now. I'll break out a Dremel a little later on. After the interior of the foam had been taken out, I sliced up a sheet of foam core off camera. This will act as a nice firm backing for what is now a pretty flimsy piece of XPS foam. I glued the pieces together using foam-safe superglue so as not to melt anything, which got a thumbs up from the Pink Panther. Once the glue was set, I broke out my hot wire knife, and I was hoping that this would be sufficient for the texture to represent those ore bodies. I worked on it for quite a while, creating a lot of fumes. Luckily, I did have the window open and was wearing a respirator and had a fan blowing as well. But in the end, I'm not convinced by the texture that this created, so I will be coming back to change that later. I have been designing this around a display case that will hopefully protect it and keep dust off of it, and I dry fit that just to make sure everything was good, which it was. So the next step was to break out the basswood and start shoring up the walls of this bad boy. The main shaft here that I'm working on is over 900 feet deep. In one of Brent's videos, he rappels down the whole thing. Doesn't use the hoist or the cage, does it just on a rope by himself dangling there. And it was pretty nerve-wracking to watch, but I would recommend that video if you haven't seen it. After the vertical posts were installed, I put the cross beams in, and these are not to scale. They are not supposed to be the ladder, but visually I think having them spread out makes them stand out better. And at this point the foam texture was bothering me, so I broke out my Dremel and a vacuum and began carving away. The first pass removed the majority of the material, and then the second pass, which I used a sharper bit for, gave the rock its more rocky texture. After that was cleaned up, I finished the remainder of the shoring. And the thing is, most of the mine, from the footage I've seen, doesn't have shoring like this in it, so I made sure it was kind of sparse and in places where there would be more likely to be cave-ins and unexpected things. If you watch the video where they do a 3D scan of the mine, you will also notice that the tunnels are anything but perfectly straight like you see here. But this is based off the elevation diagram and is more of a general layout than a precise blueprint. I did try to match the personality and features of the levels though, specifically the boarded up 200 level. There's a small gap that needs to be squeezed through in order to reach. You can see him squeezing through here. Looks like fun. I did punch the small hole up to the shaft and then filled in the rest with the cave-in, which I made from foam and sand. And to my knowledge, Brent has not reached the 1100 level at the bottom of the mine because of a cave-in on the 900 level. So I did add that cave-in as well. To give the ground along the back of the wall a little bit more texture, I tipped the diorama back slightly and then sprinkled sand down the front. That way I could catch only a small amount of it and it would go where I wanted it to. What didn't catch a small amount was the table. But I happen to be a sand bottle filling expert and I never miss. I sealed the sand with isopropyl alcohol and watered down white glue, and when that was dry, it was time to get this thing covered in a protective layer. I only had a tiny amount of paint left in this bottle, so I detopped it and used the bottom half as a mixing pot. Into the paint I threw some Mod Podge and a touch of plaster, and then a little bit of water as well to help it reach a consistency that would allow it to be painted on and not ruin all of my nice texture, especially on those rocky sections. I then spun it around and was going to use the airbrush to prime the walls with the sand on it, and then I remembered that I had not completed the construction. The exposed beams here were left to remind me that I needed to make the hoist house, so I trimmed that down and I got to work. I'll be using this corrugated styrene for the walls. I couldn't fit an exact replica, but I got as close as I could with the space that I had. Once the roof was on the first part of the building, I glued that down and made a smaller side with the addition of a chimney. Once the building was done, I used some mud effects to texture the ground on the surface. I also decided to use that same mud effect paint from Vallejo to surface the remainder of the exposed tunnels as well, all the way back to the sand. This should give them some better visual interest and personality. Once the texture paint had dried, I primed over top of it with a black acrylic paint from the airbrush. After that round of primer, I realized I had forgotten one more thing in the construction, and that was the cage, which I built and placed at the 700 level. As far as the current scale of this thing goes, per the size of the cage, a human would stand just under 1/4 inch tall, which means that in scale this shaft is only 450 feet, which means I'd need to shrink the human scale down to 1/8 of an inch for this to be 900. Or I'd have to extend this shaft double, which I'm not going to do. If the only reason you're here was to watch me build a perfectly scaled diorama of the Union Mine at Cerro Gordo, I do apologize. The next step was to give a zenithal highlight to the rocks and the tunnels using a light gray primer. After the gray, it was time for some color. My favorite way to achieve a believable rock look is to blend oil washes directly on the rocks themselves. I mixed up any of the washes that I was running low on, and I got painting. The key here is to dot on the more colorful paints sparsely and then tie everything together with the general wash color, which in my case is burnt umber. After that, I painted the tunnels and blended in the bodies and chimneys using a light tan. I then made my way to the surface and painted the colors and weathering on the house as well. After that, I gave some highlights to the wooden beams by hand and speckled the walls with some turquoise and greens to imply all the beautiful ores that have been found in the mine. With the painting mostly done, I could now throw a cable in place to make sure that that cage didn't look like it was just floating there. And the second to last painting step was to clean up the black cutaway sections. I used a sheet of cardboard to protect everything that was behind it. The last thing to paint was the subtle hint of sky and mountains at the top right corner, which I didn't get good footage of and is barely visible in the end. With that, the painting was done and it was time to flip it over and install a battery housing. A battery housing for some lights that are, yet again, not lore accurate, but will help each of those levels stand out a bit. I always like it when you can see lights in a mine. I threaded some nano LEDs through all the holes that I had just punched with an airbrush needle. I put a bead of glue on them and pulled them all the way to the wall. After that, it was just a matter of collecting all the corresponding wires on the back and wiring them together in parallel. And with that, the construction of the mine was done. So I drilled a hole in the side of the display case, which I widened carefully using tape and a vacuum to prevent dust getting everywhere, and I installed a switch. And if the batteries ever need to be replaced, I made it so that it would be easy to pop out and pop right back in with very little effort. The door on the front of the case opens and closes, so theoretically he could add anything he wanted to the diorama if he wanted to. I carefully situated the mine in the enclosure. I got everything wired up to the switch and to the power. I took it off camera, I cleaned up the glass, and I called it good. Hey, what's up, man? Are you at Cerro Gordo right now?
I am, yeah.
Nice.
With you.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
You'll have to come out and check it out sometime. Come make the trip.
I would love to. I would absolutely love to. So on that, I made you something. Hopefully you'll recognize it. Let's turn it around here.
Oh, wow. That's the mine. That's so cool. Incredible. Yeah, the different ore bodies. Different levels. Main mine shaft. You know, a little hoist house above it even. That is really cool.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with it.
Wow.
If you like it, it's yours.
Oh, that would be amazing. Yeah, we'll put it in the museum. Let all the visitors kind of check it out and get some context for the mine. That'd be awesome. Like I said, you'll have to come down and see the whole place too.
That would be sweet. Yeah, I would absolutely love that. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out to Brent from Ghost Town Living for being the inspiration for this build today. If you guys have not seen his channel yet, you should definitely go check it out. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.